Okay, welcome. We're going live worldwide. Kind of amazing these days, you just do this and suddenly somebody in Japan is checking what we are doing here. So that's very exciting, but there is no better place to be than where you are, right? And if you want to engage the world, you have to be personally placed. We architects profess in placemaking. And if we do so, then not all places are created equal, and certainly no virtual place is created equal. Of course, we just lost all the virtual viewers here, but that's a different story. But seriously, I think it's good that you're here. I'm excited to introduce the second lecture, which actually is not going to be a lecture of the semester. I was just telling Mark that we haven't had many chances in which we have shown films in our lecture series. And this is the second time I remember. The other one was when Travis and Stanley and Judy Hallett did your film on the Spirit of Place in Ireland. So that was a few years back, maybe 5-6 years ago. So this is the second time we have this chance. And this is a film, and you will hear more from the director and one of the participants about it, that is not just pretty images, but there is a lot of heavy lifting in terms of conversation that we hope that you pay attention to. And that's all I want to say. They want to let them speak more about it. Before I forget, anybody that want to get a AIA credit for continuing education is here. So after the lecture, and if you're online, send me an email. Please come after the lecture, and then I'll take care of it later on. So let me then introduce the director and one of the participants in the film. First, the director, Thomas Barrie. He's a professor of architecture at North Carolina State University. His scholarship focuses on the symbolism, ritual use, and cultural significance of architecture. And he has published and lectured extensively in his subject areas. His most recent book is Architecture of the World Major Religions, an essay on themes, differences, and similarities, published by Brill in 2020. Professor Barrie is an award-winning architect, a fellow of the American Institute of Architects, and an Association of Collegiate School of Architecture distinguished professor, and a member of the North Carolina State Academy of Outstanding Faculty in Extension and Engagement. Tom is a good friend of mine for many, many years. He's a co-founder with me, actually, and a couple of people. And now presently chair of the Architecture, Culture, Spirituality Forum that actually created this film that you're gonna see tonight. Welcome, Tom. Thank you for coming. And then Caitlin Watson. Caitlin is a licensed architect, writer, and organizer. She practices at Sage and Coombe Architects in New York. Prior to joining Sage and Coombe, she was an associate at Clement Halban Architects, where she led a diverse range of projects, including New York University's School of Global Public Health and Thomas Barrie Retreat Center in Queens, where actually we had our conference last June. It was a fantastic place. So we saw your work, right? Really good work. In addition to her design work, she organizes for progressive change within architecture practice. Caitlin has served as New York City chapter steward and Green New Deal Working Group coordinator for the Architectural Lobby, and was founding member of the U.S. Architects Declare Steering Committee. She currently teaches a course in architecture and climate policy at Roger Williams University, and has sat on juries at schools such as Columbia and Pratt and Cornell and Auburn. Caitlin research is on art and architecture, and that has been published in Faith and Forum, 2A Magazine, Religions, and New York Review of Architecture. And she has presented at the annual meetings of the Society of Architectural Historians, the Architecture, Culture, and Spirituality Forum, and the Associate of Collegiate School of Architecture. So let's welcome Tom and Caitlin to the CUA.
Nice to be here. Good to see everybody. This is going to be a quick tee up here. You notice the questions up on the board here. Caitlin's going to tee those up in a moment. And I'm just going to say a few words here. First, the film that we will watch tonight is a result of the Architecture, Culture, and Spirituality's commitment to advance research and practice on the intersection of spirituality, the built environment, and critical contemporary issues. This includes the capacity to bridge cultural and religious differences, raise human consciousness, address environmental and cultural sustainability, advance social justice, impart beauty, and improve health and well-being. Now, this is not normally what you do when you come to a film, to have people say, we want you to think about these things, but I want to invite you to actively engage with the issues raised in this film.
So as Tom mentioned, part of the sort of impetus for making this film was to really think about what the future of architecture is and what it could be, and how we might practice moving forward. And so there are a couple of things that kind of pull on key themes within the film, a couple of questions that we want you to consider as you're watching it to help frame the way that you think about what's being said. So the first is, how do we serve the entire world's population as our clients, and how might we reorganize our practices in order to achieve that? How would a culture change that considers the earth as sacred affect the way in which we come to understand the term ecotechnology and respond to its implications? And what roles do intuition, contemplation, compassion, and moderation play in transcendent design? So with that, we'll start the film.
Thank you.
Any questions or any issues that you want to raise?
We gave you questions at the beginning. Yes, please. Just make sure you speak up,
Hey, give me a second.
or Julio will bring you the mic.
Yeah, this is my exercise. This is for today, so this is good for me.
So I wanted to ask, I'm not entirely familiar with I'm not really familiar with many of the buildings that were shown in the transcendental section. And I wanted to ask if this feeling is exclusive for buildings related to religious purposes, or can this be How do I make this question? Can the transcendental feeling be expressed or be set up in any other building with no religious context?
That's a question I think that often we say, so what makes these places special? And I think it was Rumiko who talked about that no building is inherently transcendent. That it's in some ways what we bring to the experience. And I always like to think about the built environment as being discursive. We bring ourselves to the built environment and often project onto it our feelings, our aspirations, our sense of being, and then we receive from the architecture something. So in that way, these kind of experiences can happen any place, but as architects, we are curators of space and experience. And so we have a particular responsibility to serve those purposes. The last thing I'll say is, often when people talk about, when you hear recounts of transcendent experiences, feeling uplifted, dissolving the self, they take place in nature. Well, built environments, natural environments, they're all environments.
I think another really good example of a transcendent space that is not a sacred space is actually Julio had raised the Salk Institute, and thinking about like what Khan was doing in terms of rethinking like the way that the scientific method works, and he and Salk were really interested in, thinking about how to use the building both to inspire, but also to foster collaboration. And it does that, in a lot of really cool ways. But, in that, it's like it provides a bunch of different levels of transcendence, if that makes sense. And so, really powerful buildings that change culture ultimately, give us those tools to be able to think about something that is beyond ourselves.
Okay, another question?
So the answer is yes.
Yes, totally yes, for the record.
I'd like to expand on that excellent question and ask, the images are all super compelling and they're individual buildings. And in many cases, it's hard to, unless you've been there, to understand the context of all of those places that you cite as having that ability to be transcendent or to engender a transcendent experience in the human being that's there. I'm curious to know how you would imagine something bigger than an individual building and what guidance you can give us based on the discussion here to make something simple like a street or a neighborhood or small town or a big city, how these ideas can be knit together to make a bigger environment that embraces the routine of daily life, which can have transcendent moments woven into it. It doesn't have to be a journey to a specific place. It can be just the experience of walking to work. And so I'm curious to know how you can, with maybe some examples, sort of cite a bigger complex of, or a bigger framework for having this kind of experience.
Well, I'll refer to other parts of the film where these type of issues were talked about. Recalling Brian Bell, who's the founder of Design Corps, who have been working in communities for decades now. And a very compelling statement he makes. He said, quoting Sergio Palarone, who's out at Washington State, that 90% of a building is not the building. It's the process. In other words, and he to elaborate, because I've talked to Brian about this, it's the community, you might say, strengthening, building, reaffirming, etc., that happens in a true community design process. And to me, there's something very transcendent about that. That gets you out of yourself and you start to, it's one of the things you see yourself reflected in others. You listen with an empathetic and receptive ear and so forth. Or we start to think about sustainability and that we to do so authentically, at least for me, and it's talked about in the film, that you it's developing or deepening care for all beings, compassion for all, and seeing how we are intrinsic, are intrinsic to the world and are actually quite a small part of the world. That to me is transcendent too, because that's moving beyond or moving within. Right? I could talk more about the nuanced definitions of transcendence, but the last thing I'll say, Margaret Jankowski, who's heads up Trey Trahan's urban design department in their New York office, talks a lot about, and mentions some in the film, about the larger scale of urban design. And it's not one place, it's a network. And only together does it actually form the type of places that over time, over repeated use, those of us who've lived in cities for long periods of time, it grows slowly often, our feeling of affection and belonging to where we live.
Yeah. And there's also just something about like not necessarily just urban fabric, but like the fabric of the built environment in general that treats people with dignity and that creates, spaces that respect everyone and where people have a place. Like I'm thinking of, I live in Brooklyn, and so there are places where like Prospect Park where like everyone comes there and, is together in the city. And then there are other places where, either benches are not located or garbage cans are not located, like specifically because, there is an effort to exclude the unhoused population, for example. And so, sort of larger spaces for transcendence do, I think, seek to like pull out that communal, tendency, that sort of ability for us to come together and live in a society where we are supporting each other and where we're looking again outside of our own interests and towards something bigger.
Okay, any? There and there. It's part of their way, but they work faster. They drew faster. There's the gentleman, then you.
Well, I have a question. It's in the slide. It's in a movie. It's we have to reimaginate architecture. So, what are some advice that you can give us as a student to reinvent ourselves to achieve that goal? With moving toward the future, we have to battle against AI. Yeah.
So practice needs a lot of work. I've been practicing for just over 10 years. So I have many more years of practice ahead of me than behind me still. And, ultimately, I think that it comes about rethinking, like, I think that unionization is a really important thing to start with, just because it redistributes power. So right now, the people that make decisions about what practice is and what it looks like are people who have practices that are benefiting from the sort of current structure. So I think that for us thinking about, moving forward for you, thinking about the different ways that you might practice, how you might use your skills, how you might work together in ways that don't necessarily prioritize like, your design, like your sort of signature or profit as a sort of an individual. Like, what are other ways that we could think about structuring practice? And I think Brian talked about, nonprofits. There are also things like cooperatives. There are, sort of hybrids of both of these. There are the programs that are run through design schools, like the Rural Studio, things that sort of operate in very different ways. And I think that the challenge moving forward is to think about the things that we haven't even necessarily thought about yet, and to think about how we might have new ways of getting work, have new ways of working with people in communities that serve them better and that honestly serve us better, because the current sort of structure of practice is very difficult, especially for people who are starting new firms now in the sort of economy that we have.
Yeah, there has been what Tom Fisher talked about and also has written about, the ethical turn in architecture. And it actually happened some time ago, really in the 1990s, was what is now referred to as the Boyer Report, and which it was quite explicit that the profession and the academy needed to re-engage with contemporary issues and re-engage the so-called public in contemporary issues. And at the heart of this, and Tom Fisher has written now 3 books on the subject, is ethics, is ethical positions, but most importantly, ethical thinking. And Western ethics dates from Aristotle and his Nicomachean ethics, largely misunderstood when he talks about happiness, that he talks about happiness is actually when you find your purpose in life and you find your purpose, and you have the expertise and the agency to serve the greater good, right? To serve your greater culture. And that's in essence, one of the main strata of ethics is doing the most good for the most number of people. And that does upend or subverts the typical service profession orientation of what has been the dominant model for the architectural profession. No mystery there. And I think Suchi talks about this too, that we serve beyond, right, what the commission tells us, right? As Christopher Alexander years ago said, when you design a building, you don't just do the building, but you heal the city in which it's placed. Right? I always thought that was very, very compelling. The last thing I'll say is, and Brian Bell talks about this, and this now, thankfully, is much more understandable, are new actual organizational models of practice, the nonprofit model. Who knows Mass Design Group in Boston? Yeah, I mean, they're quite well known now, and they're a nonprofit, and they were one of the first to actually capitalize on that method. So there's new models of practice that also can get us out of the dominant systems that all of us really, grew up in practice within.
Question.
Yeah. So you guys talked a little bit about how we kind of have to deal with two worlds today between the virtual world and the real world. And then you mentioned how there's a lot of things, especially because of that virtual world, like anxiety and depression that people constantly are feeling. And so I was just curious, how do you go about designing buildings or places that allow people to be present in? And I feel like part of the problem or the reason we have all these things is because people aren't present. They're either caught up in the past or they're really caught up in the future.
I mean, I think that this is sort of like the ultimate question that you have as a designer, right? Is how to create spaces that are meaningful for people. And I think that is partly through thinking about, some of these things about, sort of like maybe phenomenological characteristics of a space. What is it like? How does it feel to be there? But I think it's also about creating spaces that mean something to people, so no matter how beautiful a space is, if it's not important to the community that uses it, they're not going to take care of it. It's not going to hold up over time. People won't go there. So it's also about creating spaces that are rooted and really doing that work of making sure that you understand like what a community or a user group needs out of the space. Because that really gives it, I think, a different level of meaning.
So we've thought quite a bit about what do we mean by spiritual approaches to the built environment. Spirituality is a pretty common, almost ubiquitous word and largely misunderstood. So I think it is a benefit to be specific. And in the case of your question, it includes empathy, right? Care, compassion, and having just those as examples be pivot points that guide design decisions, right? Because we make decisions when we design, we have to, that help guide our decisions. And I think a good analogy is perhaps medical care, right? We want our doctors that we go to be experts, well-educated, no diseases and treatments and so forth. But studies show that people really heal when they feel cared for. And I think that's how we respond to certain environments. If they're created with care and not for other reasons. And the more recent history of our profession is full of other reasons. then I think those become those types of places. So it's subtle and nuanced, but I think absolutely palpable. And I think the salt is a very good example. A lot of hard science goes on there, but was Khan satisfied with a really efficient, state-of-the-art laboratory building? No. Is it a state-of-the-art laboratory building? Yes, it is. But it's much, much more than that. And it's for everybody. The scientists love it. Think of it. All the people that have been there, right? They just go, oh,
Beauty. Let's be absolutely politically incorrect beauty. Last question.
Thank you for the film. It was really interesting and learned a lot. My question is kind of head back to the ethics part of the film, and one of the quotes I want to go back to is ethics leads to aesthetic outcome. And hopefully I can get some more clarity on that, because when I think about it, I think of potentially a building like the Bilbao Museum, or a building from Zaha Hadid, where it's transcendent, it's going beyond where architecture can be. But when we think about ethics, we're thinking of spaces that have longevity, have multiple use, maybe more pragmatic and has longevity. Is there maybe between ethics and transcendence possibilities for contradictions and conflicts in us trying to do the right thing, but also trying to transcend spaces?
If I understand your question, I mean, it's are ethics and aesthetics in some way incompatible? Right?
Yeah.
And this dates from the 1990s, that type of question, where and the 1990s were a very different time, right? And this was, we've been through all the isms, right? Modernism, postmodernism, deconstructivism, and so on, right? And it was a very heady time, a lot of very exciting thinking about the creation of space and architecture and form and so forth. And when this turn happened, and suddenly there was a lot of interest in repositioning education and architecture along more ethical terms, is expected. All the intellectual rigor is going to be lost. Our quest for exciting new forms and aesthetically pleasing, that will all go by the wayside. It's just turn into this dull gray world of kind of almost instrumental decisions, right? That, of course, hasn't proven to be true. And the way I see it is that you actually go beyond the object, or what we call the objecthood of architecture. That singular object, right? We all know the magazine, pictures, right? The architect, the singular object designed by the singular individual. And of course, nothing's singular. We're all interconnected. Any building is part of the fabric of its setting. Any building is the result of a whole team of people. And so we get out of then that objecthood and sole authorship with a more ethical stance, right? Also, the whole notion of building community, what's more beautiful, right, than something that actually reflects and strengthens or advances the strengths of a community. All right, I avoid the word empowers, by the way. And so, ethics, beauty and ethics are terms that have been expanded, and that expansion needs to be recognized. Elaine Scarry wrote, I'll recommend on beauty and being just, and I'll end there. That's a very good one to read.
Yeah, I think these things are obviously like very sticky terms and they do come into conflict with each other a lot. And it's definitely possible for something that is not necessarily ethical or that has some ethical hiccups to be transcendent, right? Or to be transcendent in some aspects. So like a great example is the High Line. So, you know, it's like this wonderful public space, goes through New York. It's beautiful. People love to hang out there. A lot of tourists love to hang out there. It made an entire swath of Manhattan incredibly unaffordable and was a vehicle for like private investment in luxury condos, basically. So, you know, it's like it did a lot of harm. It displaced a lot of people, but it also has become a sort of a resource for the city. So, you know, I think that that's the question that we have to ask ourselves when we're designing something, when we're deciding whether to take on a project even. It's like, what's the potential good, but also what's the potential bad, and to try to anticipate that potential bad and like not do it, right? So what we should aspire for are transcendent spaces that are also like ethically grounded. And I think that the sort of aesthetic question, the question of transcendence, has to do with like the thing once it is there, and the ethical question has to do with what we ask ourselves as we're creating it, about what we want it to do, what it can do, and what it will do.
Thank you very much, Caitlin and Tom. We have a reception, so please join us in Miller. And if you want to have some AIA credits, please come and put your name down and your number and take care of it. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thanks for your question. All right.